where the secrets of the heart are written with ink and sealed with scandal. Welcome to channel, The Countess Chronicles.
You ever notice how the worst betrayals don't come with screaming or drama? They come quiet, like finding out someone's been lying to your face while smiling the whole time. That's what happened to Lady Katie Ashford. 4 years of love letters, 4 years of promises, 4 years of building her entire future around a man she'd never met. And then, one afternoon, in a dusty study that smelled like old secrets and expensive cigars, she discovered the truth that would shatter everything she thought she knew about love, trust, and her own worth. Here's the thing that'll make your blood boil. Those letters weren't even from him. The Duke she'd been writing to, pouring her heart out to, planning a life with? He had no idea she existed. It was his grandfather, a bored old man who thought it'd be amusing to create a fake romance while his grandson was off fighting in a war. Can you imagine? 4 years of your life, gone. 4 years of turning down other suitors, defending your choices, believing in something beautiful. All of it just a cruel game played by someone who saw your vulnerability as entertainment. That's the kind of conspiracy that doesn't just break hearts. It destroys your ability to trust anything real ever again. But Lady Katie didn't fall apart. She didn't beg for explanations or drown in self-pity like everyone expected. No, she did something that shocked her entire world and might just change how you think about your own life. She gathered every single one of those letters, the ones that had meant everything to her, and she burned them. One by one, slowly, deliberately, watching 4 years turn to ash. And when the last flame died out, she spoke only 14 words. 14 words that would echo through her entire county and eventually reach the ears of the real Duke Edmund Blackwell, who'd been hiding right under her nose the whole time. Those 14 words? They weren't about revenge. They weren't about anger. They were about something far more powerful, about knowing your own value when everyone else has treated you like a joke, about choosing dignity over desperation, about walking away from pretty lies because you finally understand you deserve ugly truths. And here's the paradox that's gonna mess with your head. By refusing to fight for something fake, Lady Katie ended up discovering something real. But not in the way you think. Not in some fairy tale ending where the guy grovels and she forgives and they ride off into the sunset. Reality? It's way more complicated than that, and way more interesting. See, what Lady Katie learned in that moment, standing in front of a fireplace watching her dreams literally go up in smoke, is something most people never figure out their entire lives. It's the secret that separates people who get used from people who get respected. The hidden codes that determine whether you spend your life waiting for someone else to validate you or whether you become the kind of person who validates themselves. And I'm going to tell you right now, this isn't just some historical story about dukes and estates and old-timey romance. This is about you, about that relationship you're holding on to that deep down you know isn't real, about that job that keeps promising you a promotion that never comes, about that friend who only calls when they need something, about all the ways we build our lives around traces of what we wish was true instead of what actually is. So here's what we're going to unpack in this story. How Lady Katie spent 4 years constructing an entire future on letters that were lies. How she discovered the truth in the most devastating way possible. How the real Duke showed up disguised as a servant, and she started falling for him without knowing who he was. How he kept that hidden identity while watching her burn those letters and speak those 14 words that would haunt him forever. And most importantly, how she transformed from a woman waiting to be chosen into a woman who chose herself. Because that transformation? That's where the real power lives. That's where everything changes. You ready for this? Because I'm warning you. This story's gonna make you uncomfortable. It's gonna make you look at your own life and ask some hard questions. It's gonna challenge everything you thought you knew about love and forgiveness and second chances. But if you stick with me through this, if you really listen to what happened and why it matters, you might just walk away with the tools to recognize when you're accepting less than you deserve. And more importantly, the courage to do something about it. Let's dive into the mystery of Lady Katie Ashford and the 14 words that changed everything. You know that feeling when you're absolutely certain about something? When you'd bet your life on it? That's where Lady Katie Ashford was. For 4 long years, she built an entire future in her mind. Brick by brick, letter by letter. Every envelope that arrived from Duke Edmund Blackwell felt like a secret promise, sealed with wax and hope. She'd trace her fingers over his handwriting, memorizing every curve, every loop. "This is real," she'd whisper to herself in her chambers. "This is my destiny." But here's the thing about building castles on letters. You're constructing them on paper, not stone. And paper, well, it burns real easy. Let me paint you a picture, 'cause this is where the enigma gets darker. Lady Katie wasn't just reading love letters from Edmund. She was investing everything she had, her dreams, her reputation, her entire sense of self, into words on parchment. Think about it like this. Imagine spending years planning your dream wedding, picking out every detail, telling everyone you know about your fiancé. But you've never actually met them face to face. Sounds crazy, right? Yet, that's exactly what folks did back then. Arranged marriages through correspondence weren't uncommon among nobility. But this carried a hidden code of deception she couldn't even begin to imagine. Lady Katie would wake up early just to check if the mail coach had arrived at Ashford Manor. Her heart would race every single time. Is there a letter from Edmund today? Did he write? And when there was one, when there was one, she'd find the quietest corner of the estate, break that seal like she was unwrapping the most precious gift, and devour every word. Edmund wrote about battles and bravery, about missing her voice even though he'd never heard it, about counting down the days until they'd finally be together. Pretty words, beautiful words, words that felt like traces of a love story written in the stars. Except they weren't his words at all. Here's what nobody tells you about emotional investment. It doesn't care about truth. Your heart doesn't fact-check. When Lady Katie wanted something badly enough, she'd find evidence everywhere. She'd read, "I long for the day we meet, my dearest Katie," and picture their first embrace at Blackwell Estate. She'd see, "You're always in my thoughts," and imagine Edmund lying awake in his military tent, thinking of her. Every sentence became a brick in this massive fortress of belief she was building. And man, was it elaborate. She knew what dress she'd wear when Edmund returned from the war. She'd picked out names for their future children. Henry for a boy, Eleanor for a girl. She'd even started redecorating rooms in Ashford Manor to match what she imagined Edmund's tastes would be. That's not just hope, that's architecture. But let's get real for a second, 'cause this applies to all of us. How many times have you built up something in your head that didn't exist yet? That job you were gonna get? That person who was gonna change? That business that was gonna take off? We're all guilty of it. We invest so much energy into the idea of something that we forget to check if the foundation's even solid. Lady Katie was doing the same thing, except her foundation was literally made of paper and ink. And the conflict brewing underneath? She had no clue it was even there. Everything seemed perfect. Too perfect. which should have been the first red flag, honestly. Now here's where the story takes a sharp turn. And trust me, you're gonna want to hear this. One afternoon, after 4 years of waiting, Lady Katy decided enough was enough. Edmund should be back from the war by now, she thought. I'm going to Blackwell Estate. So she packed a small bag, told her mother, Lady Margaret, she was visiting her friend Miss Pemberton, and rode for 2 days straight to reach his property in the countryside. Picture this: a young woman, alone, traveling through roads that weren't exactly safe, fueled entirely by love and anticipation. When Lady Katy finally arrived at those massive iron gates of Blackwell Estate, her hands were shaking. "This is it," she whispered. "This is where my new life begins." Little did she know, she was about to stumble upon a revelation that would shatter everything. The estate was quiet. Too quiet. Mrs. Hewitt, the elderly housekeeper, let Lady Katy in, confused about why a strange lady was asking for Duke Edmund. "He's not here, miss. Won't be back for weeks." But Lady Katy insisted. "I just need to see his study. Please, I've traveled so far." Something in her desperation must have worked, because Mrs. Hewitt finally relented with a heavy sigh. Lady Katy was led through corridors lined with portraits of stern-faced Blackwell ancestors, each one seeming to guard some hidden family secret. And then, there it was, the Duke's study, his desk, and on that desk, a wooden chest, covered in dust, with a broken lock hanging loose. Her curiosity, or maybe it was destiny, made her open it. Inside were letters, hundreds of them, but they were sorted into 2 stacks, and that's when the silence in that room became deafening. One stack, letters addressed to Lady Katy, ready to be sent. The other stack, letters from Lady Katy herself, received and apparently never read carefully enough. And right there, tucked in the corner, was a journal. Old, leather-bound, with shaky handwriting that definitely didn't match the letters she'd received. Lady Katy opened it with trembling fingers. Read the first page, then the second. And by the third page, her whole world, the one she'd spent 4 years building, started crumbling like a sandcastle hit by a wave. The handwriting in the journal matched Edmund's letters perfectly. But it wasn't Edmund's handwriting. It belonged to someone else entirely. Someone whose motives were about to become painfully, devastatingly clear to poor Lady Katy. The truth hit Lady Katy like a punch to the gut. It wasn't Duke Edmund who'd been writing to her all this time. It was his grandfather, Lord Arthur Blackwell, a man she'd never met, never even heard Edmund mention in any real detail. 4 years of letters. 4 years of my dearest Katy, my beloved, when we finally meet. All of it? A lie. A cruel, elaborate game played by a bored old man who found entertainment in creating a fake courtship while his grandson was off fighting in some distant war. The journal entries made it crystal clear. Day 47 of my little correspondence experiment. The girl writes back with such passion. Quite amusing. That's what she was to him. A diversion. A secret joke. And the worst part? Edmund probably had no clue this conspiracy even existed. Here's the thing that'll make your blood boil. Lord Arthur wasn't senile. He wasn't confused. He knew exactly what he was doing. Every single letter was carefully crafted to keep Lady Katy hooked, to make her believe she was building something real with Edmund. It's like discovering that the person you've been talking to online for years isn't who they claim to be, except way worse, because Lady Katy had built her entire future around this. She'd turned down other suitors. She'd defended Edmund to her family when they questioned why she was waiting so long. She'd stood firm against every doubt, every whisper, every raised eyebrow. And now, she looked like a fool. A complete and utter fool who'd been played by an old man's twisted sense of humor. Think about the emotional devastation for a second. Lady Katy had poured her heart into those letters. She'd shared her deepest fears, her wildest dreams, her most vulnerable moments. She'd written about losing her father, about feeling lost in society's expectations, about hoping Edmund would be her partner in building a different kind of life. And Lord Arthur? He'd read it all like it was some entertaining novel. Maybe he even shared bits with his friends over brandy. Listen to what the Ashford girl wrote today. She actually believes my grandson is madly in love with her. The thought alone is enough to make you sick. This wasn't just deception. This was emotional robbery. He'd stolen 4 years of her life, her trust, her ability to believe in love itself. But here's where it gets even more twisted. And this is the part that shows how deep this enigma really went. Lord Arthur had created an entire personality for Edmund through these letters. He'd made him sensitive, thoughtful, romantic. Everything a young woman would want. The real Edmund? Lady Katy had no idea who he actually was. For all she knew, he could be completely different. Maybe he was cold. Maybe he was cruel. Maybe he didn't even want to get married at all. She'd fallen in love with a ghost, a phantom crafted by someone else's imagination. It's like building your dream house only to realize you've been constructing it on someone else's land, with materials that don't even exist. Now, let's connect this to something real, because this pattern happens all the time, just in different ways. How many people have you seen fall for a carefully curated online persona, only to meet the person and realize nothing matches? Or what about folks who fall for someone's potential rather than their reality? Lady Katy's situation might have happened in the 1800s, but the principle is timeless. We all project. We all fill in the blanks with what we want to see rather than what's actually there. The difference is, she didn't know she was doing it. She thought those letters were traces of Edmund's true soul. She thought she was getting to know him. But really? She was getting to know Lord Arthur's creative writing skills. The shame she felt in that moment, standing in that study with trembling hands, must have been unbearable. Can you imagine? She'd told everyone, her mother, her sisters, her friends, the entire social circle, about her engagement to Duke Edmund. She'd described him based on those letters. She'd defended their unconventional courtship. "We have a deep connection," she'd insisted. But something else was brewing inside Lady Katy too. Something darker than shame. Anger. Pure, hot, justified rage. How dare he? How dare Lord Arthur play with her life like she was some character in a story he was writing? She'd been real in those letters. Her feelings had been real. Her vulnerability had been real. And he'd treated it all like entertainment, like some hidden game where she was the unwitting participant and he held all the cards. The conflict inside her was tearing her apart. Part of her wanted to scream, to destroy that study, to ride straight to wherever Edmund was and demand answers. But another part just wanted to disappear, to pretend this had never happened, to protect what little dignity she had left. Mrs. Hewitt knocked softly on the study door, startling Lady Katy out of her spiral. "Miss, are you quite all right? You've been in there for nearly an hour." Lady Katy looked down at the journal still clutched in her hands, at the letters scattered across the desk, at the evidence of her own foolishness laid out like pieces of a puzzle she'd been too blind to see. She carefully placed everything back in the chest, closed the lid, and took a deep breath. When she walked out of that study, something had shifted in her eyes. The innocence was gone. The hopeful girl who'd arrived at Blackwell Estate had died in that room. And the woman who walked out? She was someone entirely different. Someone who just learned the hardest lesson of her life. Not everyone who writes "I love you" actually means it. And sometimes, the person writing those words isn't even the person you think they are. Now, here's where fate decides to throw the biggest plot twist imaginable. And honestly, you couldn't make this stuff up if you tried. 3 days after Lady Katie returned home from Blackwell Estate, still reeling, still processing the revelation that shattered her world, she needed help. Ashford Manor was struggling financially, something her mother, Lady Margaret, had kept hidden for months. They needed to hire someone to manage the estate's accounts and oversee the staff. So Lady Katie placed an advertisement in town for a steward. And who showed up at her door, resume in hand, looking for work? Duke Edmund Blackwell himself. Except she had absolutely no idea who he was. Think about the sheer irony of this moment. Edmund had finally returned from the war, discovered his grandfather's twisted little game, and was furious. He wanted nothing to do with this arranged marriage nonsense. The thought of being tied to some woman who'd built up a fantasy version of him based on fake letters, it made his skin crawl. So when he heard through the grapevine that the Ashford estate was hiring, he saw an opportunity. He'd go undercover, see what kind of person Lady Katie really was, and figure out how to break off this ridiculous engagement without causing a massive scandal. Simple plan, right? Except nothing about this situation was gonna be simple. Lady Katie looked at the tall, dark-haired man standing in her drawing room and saw exactly what he wanted her to see: a potential employee. "Mr. Blackwell, is it?" she asked, glancing at the false surname he'd given. "Edmund Thorne." He nodded, keeping his expression neutral. "I have experience managing large estates, my lady. I'm efficient with numbers, firm with staff, and I keep my head down and do my work." She studied him for a moment, noticing the way he carried himself. Too confident for a regular steward, too refined in his manners. But she was desperate, and he seemed capable. "You're hired," she said simply. "You start tomorrow." And just like that, the greatest enigma of both their lives began to unfold. Here's where it gets psychologically fascinating, and this is something we can all learn from. Edmund thought he was playing detective, gathering evidence about Lady Katie's true character. But what he didn't count on? Actually getting to know her. See, when you strip away titles and expectations, when you remove the codes of nobility and social performance, people show you who they really are. And Lady Katie? She was nothing like he expected. She wasn't some vapid, entitled noble who'd swooned over fake love letters. She was sharp. She was kind to the servants but firm when needed. She was struggling to save her family's legacy while dealing with grief, financial stress, and, though Edmund didn't know the full extent yet, the betrayal of discovering those letters were fake. Over the next few weeks, something unexpected started happening. Edmund, disguised as Mr. Thorne, the steward, found himself actually enjoying Lady Katie's company. She'd join him in the estate office to review accounts, and they'd end up talking for hours, not about romance or marriage or any of that nonsense, but about real things. She told him about her father's death, about the pressure of being the eldest daughter, about her dream of turning part of the manor into a school for local children. He found himself sharing, too, carefully editing his stories, but speaking more honestly than he had in years. "You're easy to talk to, Mr. Thorne," she said one afternoon, surprising them both. "Most men either patronize me or try to court me. You just treat me like a person." But here's the cruel twist that makes this whole situation feel like some cosmic joke. Lady Katie was falling for him, for Mr. Thorne, the man she thought was her employee. She'd catch herself looking forward to their morning meetings, She'd find excuses to ask his opinion on things that had nothing to do with estate management. And the worst part? She felt guilty about it. Because in the back of her mind, she still believed she was technically engaged to Duke Edmund, even though she'd decided to break it off as soon as he returned. "I'm being ridiculous," she'd tell herself at night. "He's the steward, and I'm supposed to be waiting for a duke who'll never actually want me anyway." The conflict inside her was exhausting, caught between a phantom fiancé she now resented and a real man she couldn't have. Edmund, meanwhile, was having his own crisis. He'd gone into this thinking he'd find proof that Lady Katie was shallow or opportunistic or whatever would make it easy to walk away. Instead, he was discovering someone extraordinary, someone who'd been hurt but hadn't become bitter, someone who'd been lied to but still chose kindness. He watched her comfort a crying maid who'd broken an expensive vase. He saw her give her own portion of dinner to a stable boy who looked too thin. He heard her laugh, really laugh, at something silly, and it did something to his chest he wasn't prepared for. "This wasn't supposed to happen," he muttered to himself one night. But it was happening, and he had no idea how to fix it. The most painful part of all this? They were both falling in love with the truth of each other while surrounded by lies. She didn't know he was the Duke. He didn't know she'd already discovered his grandfather's deception. They were two people being authentic with each other, in the middle of the most inauthentic situation imaginable. It's like that moment when you realize the person you've been looking for has been right in front of you all along. Except there's a massive hidden barrier between you that neither person knows how to cross. Lady Katie would think, if only Mr. Thorne were noble, if only things were different. And Edmund would think, if only she'd fallen for me and not the fantasy version my grandfather created. Both of them wanting the same thing but believing it was impossible. And the silence between what they felt and what they could say? It was growing louder every single day. Everything came crashing down on a cold October evening. Edmund, still playing the role of Mr. Thorne, was working late in the estate office when he heard footsteps. He looked up to see Lady Katie walking past, headed toward the main drawing room, her arms full of something he couldn't quite make out. Curiosity got the better of him, so he followed quietly, staying in the shadows. What he saw next would haunt him for the rest of his life. Lady Katie was kneeling in front of the massive stone fireplace, and spread out on the floor beside her were dozens and dozens of letters. His grandfather's letters, the ones that had built and then destroyed her entire world. She didn't rush. That's what struck Edmund most. She wasn't acting out of rage or impulse. Her movements were deliberate, almost ceremonial. Lady Katie picked up the first letter, the one that had started it all 4 years ago, and just held it for a moment. She traced her finger over the seal, the one she'd broken with such excitement back then. "I really believed you," she whispered to the paper. Then, with steady hands, she placed it in the flames. The wax seal melted first, that deep crimson turning liquid and dripping like blood. The edges of the parchment curled, turned brown, then black. And she just watched, calm, collected, like she was performing the most important ritual of her life. One by one, she fed those letters to the fire. Each one represented a moment she'd treasured, a promise she'd believed, a future she'd imagined, a version of love she'd thought was real. Edmund watched from the doorway, frozen, as this woman he'd come to deeply care for destroyed the traces of his grandfather's cruel game. Some letters she held longer than others. He could see her lips moving, probably remembering what they'd said. "I cannot wait to hold you in my arms, my dearest Katie. Every day apart from you feels like an eternity. You are my North Star, guiding me home. All lies, all gone, all turning to ash and floating up the chimney like the ghosts of broken promises. Then she stopped. Edmund thought maybe she was done, but she reached for something else. A small bundle of letters tied with a blue ribbon. Her letters. The ones she'd sent. The ones his grandfather had kept but never truly valued. And this was when Edmund saw the full weight of what his grandfather had done. Lady Katy untied that ribbon slowly, like she was saying goodbye to the girl who'd written those words. "I told you everything," she said quietly, her voice cracking just slightly. "I trusted you with pieces of myself I'd never shown anyone." She placed her own letters in the fire, too, one after another, watching herself burn, watching her own vulnerability and hope and love disappear into nothing. When the last letter caught flame, Lady Katy sat back on her heels and stared into the fire. The room was silent except for the crackling of burning paper and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Edmund should have left. He should have backed away and pretended he'd never seen this. But he couldn't move. He was witnessing something sacred and terrible all at once, a woman reclaiming her power in the only way she knew how. And then she spoke. Not to anyone in particular, just to the universe, to herself, maybe to the ghost of who she used to be. 14 words that would echo in Edmund's mind forever. I deserve someone who is real, not a lie wrapped in pretty words. Her voice was steady, not sad, not angry, just certain, final. It was a declaration, a promise to herself, a line drawn in the sand. She stood up, brushed the ash from her dress, and took one last look at the fireplace where 4 years of her life had just turned to smoke. "I'm done waiting for ghosts," she added quietly. And then she walked out of the room, her head held high, leaving Edmund standing there in the shadows, absolutely shattered by what he'd just witnessed. She hadn't said those words for him. She didn't even know he was there. But they hit him harder than any accusation or angry confrontation ever could have. Ever. See, here's what makes this moment so powerful, and why it matters for all of us. Lady Katy wasn't performing for anyone. This wasn't about revenge or making a point or getting sympathy. This was about dignity. She could have kept those letters, used them as evidence of Lord Arthur's deception, maybe even leveraged them to demand some kind of compensation or public apology. But she didn't want that. She wanted freedom. She wanted to stop carrying the weight of someone else's lies. And the only way to do that? Burn it all down. Create space for something real. It's like that moment when you finally delete all the text messages from someone who hurt you. Not because you're trying to forget, but because you're choosing to remember yourself instead. Edmund stood in that hallway for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. His mind was racing. She knew. Somehow, she'd figured out the truth about the letters. And instead of confronting him, or whoever she thought was responsible, she'd simply removed herself from the equation. She'd chosen herself. And watching her do that, watching her refuse to be diminished by his grandfather's conspiracy, made Edmund realize something terrifying. He'd fallen completely in love with Lady Katy. Not the idea of her, not some projection or fantasy. The real her. The woman who could be devastated by betrayal and still walk away with grace. The woman who deserved someone real. And he, hiding behind a fake name, lying about who he was just another pretty lie she'd eventually have to burn. The fire died down, leaving nothing but glowing embers and the faint smell of burned paper and melted wax. But something else had been burned that night too, the hidden barrier of pretense, at least on Edmund's side. He couldn't keep lying to her. He couldn't keep playing this role, knowing what he now knew. Tomorrow, he'd have to tell her the truth. Tomorrow, he'd have to face her and reveal that he was Duke Edmund Blackwell, the man whose name had been attached to those letters, even if he'd never written a single word. Tomorrow, he'd have to watch those steady eyes turn cold when she realized he'd been deceiving her too, just in a different way. But tonight, he just stood there in the growing darkness, listening to the silence, knowing that everything was about to change, and having absolutely no idea if she'd ever be able to forgive him for being just one more secret in a story that had already broken her heart once. Edmund didn't sleep that night. How could he? He kept seeing Lady Katie's face illuminated by firelight, kept hearing those 14 words echoing in his head like a judgment. I deserve someone who is real, not a lie wrapped in pretty words. And what was he? He was another lie, maybe not the same kind his grandfather had constructed, but a lie nonetheless. He'd been living in her home for weeks under a false name, watching her, studying her, all while knowing something she didn't, that he was the very man whose phantom had haunted her for 4 years. The weight of that secret was crushing him, and for the first time in his life, Edmund understood what true guilt felt like. Morning came too quickly. Edmund dressed slowly, rehearsing 1,000 different ways to tell her the truth. Lady Katie, I need to confess something. No, too formal. There's something you should know about me. Too vague. I'm Duke Edmund Blackwell. Too blunt. Nothing felt right, because there was no right way to tell someone you'd been deceiving them, even if your intentions weren't malicious. He made his way down to the estate office, expecting to find her there for their usual morning meeting. But she wasn't there. Mrs. Thornberry, the head housekeeper, informed him that Lady Katie had requested he meet her in the gardens instead. That's when Edmund's stomach dropped. The gardens, a public enough space that she could maintain propriety, but private enough for a difficult conversation. She knew something. Or maybe she was about to dismiss him. Either way, this was it. He found her sitting on a stone bench beneath an old oak tree, the autumn leaves falling around her like golden rain. She looked different somehow, lighter, despite everything. There was something in her posture, in the way she held herself, that spoke of a burden released. When she heard his footsteps, she turned, and Edmund braced himself for anger or coldness. But what he saw in her eyes was something else entirely. Clarity. "Mr. Thorne," she said, and there was the slightest emphasis on the false name, like she was testing it. "Please, sit. We need to talk." Edmund sat, his heart pounding so hard he was sure she could hear it. This was the moment. The revelation. The end of everything. "I've made a decision," Lady Katie began, looking straight ahead at the gardens rather than at him. "I'm ending my engagement to Duke Edmund Blackwell, officially. I'm writing to his family today to inform them." Edmund opened his mouth to speak, but she held up a hand. "Please, let me finish. I don't know if you're aware of the arrangement. You probably heard servants gossip, but I was supposed to marry a man I'd never met. A man who wrote me letters for 4 years. Her voice remained steady, but Edmund could hear the thread of old pain running through it. Those letters were beautiful. They were everything a young girl dreams of hearing. But they weren't real. And I've decided I'd rather be alone forever than build my life on another fantasy." Edmund felt like he was being torn apart from the inside. This was his opening. This was the moment to tell her everything. That he was Edmund. That he'd never written those letters. That his grandfather had committed this unforgivable deception. That he'd come here under false pretenses, but had found something real. But before he could speak, Lady Katie continued. "The reason I'm telling you this, Mr. Thorne, is because—" She paused, and for the first time he saw her composure crack just slightly. "Because you've shown me what real looks like. These past weeks, working with you, talking with you, you've never tried to be anything other than who you are. You've never made promises you couldn't keep or painted pictures of futures that don't exist. You've just been present, honest, real." The word real hit Edmund like a physical blow. Here she was, praising him for honesty, and he was living the biggest lie of all. "Lady Katie, he started, but she cut him off again, this time turning to face him directly. "I know this is inappropriate. I know you're my employee, and I'm supposedly engaged, and there are 100 reasons why I shouldn't say what I'm about to say. But last night, when I burned those letters, I made a promise to myself. No more silence. No more swallowing truths, because they're inconvenient. So here's my truth, Mr. Thorne. You've become important to me. More important than propriety says you should be." The vulnerability in her eyes was devastating. She was offering him her heart, the real one, the one that had been burned before. And Edmund knew, with absolute certainty, that he couldn't accept it while still lying. "Stop," Edmund said, the word coming out harsher than he intended. Lady Katie's face fell, and he immediately hated himself for it. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean—" "Lady Katie, you need to know something. I'm not who you think I am." Here it was, the moment of truth. No more codes, no more hidden identities. "My name isn't Thorne. It's Blackwell. Duke Edmund Blackwell. I'm the man you were supposed to marry." The silence that followed was so complete, so absolute, that Edmund could hear individual leaves hitting the ground. Lady Katie just stared at him, her expression shifting from confusion to recognition to something that looked horribly like betrayal all over again. "You're him," she said flatly, standing up from the bench like she needed physical distance. "This whole time. You've been here, in my home, watching me, and you never said anything." Her voice was controlled, but Edmund could see her hands shaking. "I trusted you. I just told you. I just said you were real, that you were honest. And you—" She laughed, but there was no humor in it, only bitter understanding. "I'm such a fool. How you must have laughed, watching me fall for another lie. Was this entertaining for you? Did you want to see how far the stupid girl would go? Did you make a game of it, like your grandfather did?" Each word was a knife, and Edmund deserved every single one. He'd thought he was protecting her, protecting them both, by waiting for the right moment. But there was never going to be a right moment for this kind of truth. "It wasn't like that," Edmund said desperately, standing too, wanting to reach for her, but knowing he'd lost that right. "I came here because I was angry about those letters. Letters I never wrote, I swear to you. I wanted to see what kind of person would believe such a fantasy. But then I met you, the real you, and everything changed. Lady Katie, please." But she was already walking away, her spine rigid, her steps quick and determined. And Edmund just stood there, watching her go, understanding too late what his silence had cost them both. He'd wanted to give her truth, but he'd waited too long, and now his honesty just looked like another layer of deception. The greatest tragedy? Everything he'd said about his feelings was completely real. But she'd never believe that now. Not when every moment they'd shared had been built on a foundation of yet another secret. The forbidden truth had finally come out. But instead of setting them free, it had locked them both in separate cages of pain they didn't know how to escape. The days that followed were torture for both of them, but in completely different ways. Lady Katie retreated into herself, not with sadness, but with something far more powerful: determination. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. She didn't lock herself in her room like society expected a heartbroken woman to do. Instead, she did something that shocked everyone around her. She doubled down on herself. She threw herself into the estate's management, into her plans for the children's school, into every single project she'd put on hold, while waiting for a future that was never coming. "I wasted 4 years waiting," she told her mother, Lady Margaret, one morning. "I'm not wasting another day." And she meant it. Every single word. Here's what nobody tells you about rock bottom. Sometimes it's actually a launching pad. See, Lady Katie had been operating under a certain set of beliefs her whole life. That her value came from making a good match. That her purpose was to be someone's wife. That her dreams should be small and contained within the boundaries of what was acceptable for a woman of her station. But when everything fell apart, when both the fantasy duke and the real one revealed themselves to be liars in different ways, something inside her just snapped. Not in a breaking way, but in a breaking free way. "If I'm going to be alone," she decided, "then I'm going to be magnificently alone. I'm going to build something that matters." And that shift? That's where real power lives. She started making changes immediately. The children's school she'd been dreaming about? She stopped dreaming and started building. She converted the east wing of Ashford Manor, hired teachers from the village, and opened enrollment to any child who wanted to learn, regardless of their family's ability to pay. The local gentry thought she'd lost her mind. A lady running a school? How scandalous. But Lady Katie didn't care anymore about scandal. She cared about legacy. She cared about doing something real with her life instead of just waiting for life to happen to her. And you know what? The school flourished. Within months, 30 children were attending daily, learning to read and write and think for themselves. Lady Katie had found her purpose, and it had nothing to do with marriage or titles or any man's approval. Meanwhile, Edmund was falling apart in ways that weren't so productive. He'd moved out of Ashford Manor immediately after the garden confrontation. Of course he had. What choice did he have? But he couldn't move on from Lady Katie. He'd return to Blackwell Estate and try to resume his ducal duties, but everything felt hollow. He'd sit in his grandfather's old study, the same study where Lady Katie had discovered the truth, and just stare at the walls. Lord Arthur had died 2 months before Edmund returned from war, never facing consequences for his cruel game. And Edmund was left holding the pieces of the enigma his grandfather had created, trying to figure out how to make anything right when everything felt so fundamentally wrong. But here's where Edmund started to understand something crucial, something that applies to all of us. You can't fix a broken trust by explaining your intentions. Lady Katie didn't care that Edmund hadn't written those fake letters. She didn't care that he'd technically been trying to figure out a messy situation. What she cared about was that he'd lied to her face for weeks while she opened her heart to him. "I would have understood," she'd told him during their last conversation before he left. "If you'd just been honest from the beginning, I would have understood. But you chose deception, just like your grandfather did. Maybe in a different way, but the result is the same. I can't trust you." And she was right. Edmund had to sit with that. He had to accept that his actions, regardless of his intentions, had caused real harm. So Edmund did something unexpected. He started working on himself instead of trying to win Lady Katie back. He read his grandfather's journal cover to cover, trying to understand what kind of man finds entertainment in manipulating others' emotions. He went through therapy, well, the 1800s version of it, which meant long conversations with a trusted mentor about accountability and character. He volunteered at a veterans' hospital, helping soldiers who'd returned from war with wounds both visible and invisible. He stopped hiding behind his title and started asking himself hard questions. Who am I without the duchy? What do I actually value? What kind of man do I want to be? These weren't comfortable questions, but they were necessary ones. Months passed. Lady Katy heard through social circles that Duke Edmund had changed, that he was different, humbler, more genuine, but she didn't care. Well, that's not entirely true. Part of her did care, but she refused to let that part make her decisions anymore. She'd learned the hardest way possible that you can't build a life on potential or promises, or the hope that someone will change. You build a life on what's real, what's present, what's proven. And Edmund hadn't proven anything except that he was capable of the same silence and secrets that had devastated her before. Maybe he has changed, she told her friend Miss Pemberton one afternoon. But that's his journey. Mine is figuring out who I am without needing anyone's validation. And honestly, I'm starting to really like who I'm becoming. The transformation in Lady Katy was remarkable. And it's the kind of transformation that happens when someone stops performing for others and starts living for themselves. She became known throughout the county not as the girl who was jilted by the Duke, but as the lady who built that incredible school. She spoke at town meetings about education reform. She wrote articles for the local paper about women's property rights. She invested in businesses owned by women who couldn't get traditional funding. She became, in every sense of the word, formidable. And the most beautiful part? She did it all without bitterness. She'd processed her pain by burning those letters and making a choice. She could either let betrayal define her or let it refine her. She chose refinement. She chose growth. She chose herself. And watching from a distance, Edmund realized he'd lost something truly extraordinary. Not because she was beautiful or noble or any of those surface things, but because she'd discovered her own power, and it was absolutely breathtaking. So here's the question I want you to sit with. What are you still holding on to that you know you need to burn? What letters are you keeping in your own metaphorical chest? Letters that represent promises someone never intended to keep, potential that's never gonna materialize, versions of people that only exist in your imagination? Because here's the hard truth Lady Katy learned. You can't build a real future on fake foundations. You just can't. And every day you spend trying is another day stolen from the life you actually deserve to be living. Think about those 14 words she spoke. I deserve someone who is real, not a lie wrapped in pretty words. Now ask yourself, are you living by that standard? Or are you settling for pretty words from your boss who keeps saying, next quarter, when you ask about that raise? Are you accepting pretty words from that person who says they'll change, but never does? Are you buying pretty words from that friend who's always got an excuse for why they can't show up for you? Lady Katy could have kept those letters. She could have used them as evidence, demanded explanations, made everyone feel sorry for her. But she chose something better. She chose freedom. She chose to stop carrying weight that was never hers to carry in the first place. Here's what I need you to understand, and this is critical. Knowing your worth isn't arrogant. It's not selfish. It's not mean. It's actually the most loving thing you can do, for yourself and for everyone around you. Because when you accept less than you deserve, you're not just hurting yourself, you're teaching people that it's okay to treat you that way. You're showing them that your boundaries are negotiable, that your standards are flexible, that your dignity has a price. Lady Katy spent 4 years teaching people she'd wait forever for scraps. And you know what happened? She got scraps. It wasn't until she stood up and said no more that everything shifted. Not because the world suddenly decided to treat her better, but because she decided to treat herself better. So I'm going to challenge you right now, today, to do your own version of burning those letters. Maybe it's having that difficult conversation you've been avoiding. Maybe it's finally ending that relationship that's been dead for months, but you're too scared to admit it. Maybe it's quitting that job that's sucking your soul dry. Maybe it's just deleting that person's number so you stop checking if they've texted. Whatever it is, whatever your letters are, you know what they are. You've known for a while. The question is, are you going to keep pretending they're valuable? Or are you going to finally admit they're just paper and ink taking up space where something real could be? What would it feel like to actually choose yourself for once? To stop waiting for permission or validation or the perfect moment and just decide you're worth more? And here's the thing about Lady Katie's story that I haven't told you yet. The part that's going to stick with you. She didn't burn those letters because she stopped believing in love. She burned them because she started believing in herself. There's a difference. A huge one. She didn't become bitter or closed off or cynical. She became clear. She became powerful. She became the kind of person who could look at a situation and say, "This isn't serving me," without guilt or shame or endless second-guessing. And that clarity? That's what allowed her to build something real. That school, that legacy, that version of herself she'd been too busy waiting to become. The revelation wasn't that love is fake or people are terrible. The revelation was that she'd been looking for completion in all the wrong places when she was already whole. So let me ask you directly, what are you waiting for? What's your excuse for not stepping into the life you actually want? The timing isn't right. Lady Katie's timing sucked. She'd just been humiliated and betrayed. I don't have the resources. Her estate was barely making ends meet. People will judge me? The entire county thought she was scandalous for running a school. She did it anyway. Because here's the secret nobody tells you. There's never a perfect time to choose yourself. There's never a moment when it's easy or comfortable or risk-free. You just have to decide that your dignity, your peace, your actual life is worth more than whatever you're clinging to. And then you have to act on that decision. Not tomorrow. Not when things calm down. Not when you feel ready. Now. Today. In this moment. I want to hear from you in the comments. What's one thing you're going to stop accepting that doesn't serve you? What's your version of burning those letters? Don't just watch this video and nod along and then do nothing. Actually engage. Actually think about it. Actually commit to one specific change you're making after hearing Lady Katie's story. Because this isn't entertainment. This is a blueprint. This is a roadmap for how to reclaim your power when life has stripped you down to nothing. And if you don't apply it, if you don't actually use what you've learned here, then you've just wasted your time watching someone else's transformation instead of creating your own. And listen, if this story hit you somewhere deep, if it made you think or feel or question things you've been avoiding, then you need to subscribe to this channel right now and turn on those notifications. Because Lady Katie's story? It's just the beginning. There are dozens more stories like this. Stories about people who faced impossible choices and found strength they didn't know they had. Stories about betrayal and redemption and the messy, complicated journey of figuring out who you are when everything you thought you knew gets stripped away. These aren't fairy tales with neat endings. These are real lessons wrapped in compelling narratives, and if you're serious about growth, about actually becoming the person you're capable of being, then you can't afford to miss what's coming next. So here's my final challenge for you. Don't let Lady Katie's courage be just a story you heard once. Let it be the catalyst that changes everything. Let those 14 words, "I deserve someone who is real," not a lie wrapped in pretty words, become your new standard. Write them down. Put them somewhere you'll see them every day. And when you're tempted to accept less, when you're about to compromise your worth for comfort or convenience or fear of being alone, remember the woman who stood in front of a fireplace and chose herself. Remember that choosing yourself isn't the end of your story. It's the beginning. Now, go write your next chapter and make it one you're actually proud of.